Most people think that a private jet is the most expensive flight that you could pay for in the world. To charter one for an hour, you're going to shell out around $11,000, which is a lot of money, but nothing compared to a medical transport. Imagine you're on a hike, you roll your ankle badly in the middle of nowhere, and you need an emergency airlift. That 20 to 30 minute flight will likely cost you $32,165 just for the flight. In this video, we're deconstructing the economics of the world's most expensive flight, how some people are charged more than $30,000 while others pay just $6,129, and the hidden players responsible for these silent price hikes. Let's dive into it. In his New York Magazine article, The Air Ambulance Vultures, Chris Stanton tells the story of a couple skiing in Mammoth Lakes, California. It was January 2018, and on the last run of the day, Kathleen hit a small jump and landed hard, shattering her L1 vertebrae and her lower spine. The hospital couldn't handle the surgery, so she was loaded onto a small plane and flown 300 miles south to Loma Linda Hospital. Based on my not-so-sure estimates, I'm guessing about a 2-hour flight in a small plane. Kathleen spent 12 hours on the operating table getting a metal implant to replace her vertebrae. But less than a day after she woke up, the phone rang. It was an air ambulance provider called Guardian Flight. They called to inform Kathleen that the 300-mile plane ride cost her $97,269. If my 2-hour flight estimation is correct, that's $48,634.50 per hour. Just try to find a flight more expensive than that in the world. Even an F-35 fighter jet costs less at $42,000 an hour. But not to worry, Kathleen had insurance. They'd take care of it, right? Well, turns out Guardian Flight was not in-network, meaning they didn't have an advantageous contract with her insurance. Her insurance would pay $17,569, leaving Kathleen to pay the remainder, $79,700. But hold up, why wasn't the medical transport in-network? It's not like Kathleen can choose who picks her up in a helicopter. Well, Kathleen's case is actually more common than you might think. It's estimated that 550,000 people require an air ambulance each year in the United States. Researchers looked at 36,000 air ambulance claims, or air ambulance bills, and of those 77%, 2 in 5 were hit with an average surprise bill of $19,851. But here's the thing, if Kathleen had been 65 years old, she would have been charged $6,129, and her Medicare plan most likely would have paid for all of it. So how did we get here, and why are these rides so expensive? Although we don't have too much data on what air ambulance rides used to cost in decades past, an industry survey from 1982 showed that air ambulance charges averaged around $500, the inflation-adjusted equivalent of $1,350 today. But when researchers looked at those 36,000 air ambulance rides from between 2014 and 2017, the average charge was $35,024, a 25-fold increase. How? You'd think that the US government would step in here, especially states, since they're usually the ones who regulate health insurance and medical services. But every time a state did try to cap these insane prices, they ran into a legal brick wall built in 1978, the Airline Deregulation Act. Back then, the federal government treated airlines like public utilities. They literally told companies what they could charge and where they could fly. When this Airline Deregulation Act got passed, though, they basically decided to stop babysitting the industry and let market competition drive prices down. To make sure things stayed that way, they basically added a massive keep out sign to the states. The legislation says a state may not enact or enforce a law, regulation, or other provision related to a price, route, or service of an air carrier. And unfortunately for millions of Americans, a medical helicopter is considered an air carrier. Now, the logic behind this act was that if you let companies compete, prices are going to drop. And for your flight to Vegas or New York, it worked. Commercial fares did get way cheaper. But medical transport isn't a normal market. When you're lying on the side of a mountainside with a shattered ankle, you're not hopping on Expedia and checking prices. And you can't even really choose or say no when somebody comes to pick you up. And the legal loophole of the Airline Deregulation Act created a wild west for pricing. Since the states restricted their power to regulate, patients basically had zero bargaining power. And opportunists, for lack of a better word, saw an opportunity. Back in 2015, the private equity group KKR bought Air Medical Holdings for a little over $2 billion. Then they merged that company with American Medical Response under the name Global Medical Response, a common private equity move: consolidate smaller companies, put them together. And in 2017, another big private equity company bought Air Methods, the largest provider of air ambulances in the nation, meaning these two companies now controlled almost 2/3 of the entire US air ambulance market. And perhaps this is totally unrelated, but between 2008 and 2017, the median price charged for a helicopter air ambulance ride tripled from $12,500 to $35,900, according to the Healthcare Cost Institute. One thing that is confirmed and almost certainly related, air ambulance companies that were publicly traded or owned by private equity were more likely to be out of network, 89% in fact. What's even worse, the surprise bills were much higher for air ambulance carriers owned by private or publicly traded companies, $26,507 on average. That's the amount that the patient had to pay after insurance already paid, which is crazy. But pressure started to mount for something to change. You can't say no, you can't price shop, and depending on who helps you, you may end up facing a bill for over $20,000, and you probably paid thousands for insurance to cover things just like this. So with public outrage finally reaching a boiling point, regulators finally acted. In 2022, they passed the No Surprises Act. The law basically says that if you're forced into an out-of-network emergency flight, the provider cannot send you a balance bill, or after insurance pays a charge like the $79,000 that Kathleen received, you're only responsible to pay what you would have paid if they were in network. End of story. So that fixes it, right? If the surprise bill era is over, then there's not really any point to private equity companies owning a air ambulance company, right? Well, not necessarily. So the question remains, how does this private equity business model survive under the new No Surprises Act? You have to think that the market's going to remain fairly stable. They're not going to see a big increase in the number of patients, which would help them increase revenues. Private equity typically tries to double or triple a business within 5 to 7 years and then sell it off. How do they do that without out-of-network surprise bills? Personally, I think that realistically, they can only do 3 things that may give them the returns that they're seeking. Number 3, there's the efficiency play. When a firm like KKR buys up 5 small independent helicopter companies, they don't need 5 HR departments or 5 separate maintenance hubs. They roll them all into one giant entity like Air Methods. By slashing the back office costs while keeping the service prices high, the profit per flight stays high even if the number of flights never changes. Number 2, there's the arbitration game. The No Surprises Act stopped them from billing you, but it didn't stop them from going after your insurance. Now, instead of a debt collector calling your house, it's a high-stakes legal battle in a process called independent dispute resolution. These PE-backed giants have the data and legal budgets to bury insurers in arbitration, often winning payouts 300 to 400% higher than what Medicare would pay. But ultimately, this is just going to mean higher prices for patients, just somewhere else, insurance costs. And number 1 is vertical integration. If you own the helicopter or the ground ambulance that meets it at the pad, you can essentially steer the business to yourself. By controlling the logistics, they make sure their high-priced fleet is the default choice every single time. Now, there is a chance that none of these 3 options actually do enough for PE. And in that case, many may end up focusing on ground ambulances, which were curiously excluded from the No Surprises Act. I'll be covering that in a future video. If you found this video interesting and you'd like to see more like it in the future, please consider subscribing for more. This is Tyler Dutchover. Thanks for watching.